Good afternoon or good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Eric Goldman and Mrs. Jess Myers to you. Many of you know Dorontina Berisha already because she was part of this Ars Boni series already in one of the sessions last week. Today she's back again. I will briefly introduce all three of the speakers to you. Eric Goldman is a professor of law at Santa Clara University School of Law in the Silicon Valley. There he has been working quite intensely in the field of IP and IT law. I'm very sorry that I have some kind of background here now, which I should not have here. And I have no clue why this is happening. Okay, it's gone. Okay, so sorry again. As I said, Eric is a professor in IP and IT law. His research focuses on internet IP and advertising law topics. He's also running a blog that you will find under the address blog.ericgoldman.org. We will put this into the show notes. And he is, of course, in the field for quite some years. So I think we have a rather similar CV. So since the 90s, he has been working in the field of IP and IT and internet law. The reason why he is here today with us is that he's one of the most distinguished experts in Section 230, which is, I may say this to the European followers in the room, which is quite an equivalent to the ECommerce Directive in Europe. So very happy to have you here, Eric.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for including me.
Myers works with Professor Goldman. She is a research assistant and advisor and mentor, and he is her mentor. She's also a former Twitter legal intern and currently a legal collaborator at Tech Freedom, and has been working together with Professor Goldman on issues of Section 230 for quite some time now. And thirdly, Dorontina Berisha, she's the reason why we meet this afternoon or this morning. Tina is working in our team here in Vienna for, I don't know how many years now, 4 or 5 years now. And she is quite intensely involved in many things we do, but she also was a student, an exchange student in California, in Santa Clara. And she met Professor Goldman and Mrs. Myers there. And she made the proposal that it would be interesting and wise to invite them to this podcast series. Very pleased to have all three of you here. Eric, perhaps we could start when I ask you, I mean, I assume that Tina was not your very first European or Austrian law student. So what is the first thing you think about when you hear about European and Austrian law students? How are they different from US American students? Are they different at all?
Yeah, I've been teaching internet law for almost 25 years now. So I've had a steady stream of students from other parts of the world in my classes over the years. It's especially gratifying to have the students from Europe. In order to get into the exchange program in Santa Clara, it requires a student to really kind of have a good executive functioning skill. They kind of have to figure out all the different logistics pieces in order to make it happen. And so we often find that we get really top quality students from Europe. And it's great to have them in the classroom because otherwise we'd have a very US-centric discussion. And the European students really bring a very different perspective to the class from the get-go, just in terms of the assumptions that they have, the orientation that they bring. And that helps keeps me honest as a professor because I'm so used to thinking and talking about US law the way that we talk about it in the US, and the Europeans are often sitting there scratching their heads saying, but Professor Goldman, have you considered the way we've been discussing this in Europe? So it's really great to have that perspective in the classroom. It makes me a better professor. It makes the students get a better experience. So I'm always thrilled when I see students like Tina in our class.
Okay, thank you very much. That was indeed very impressive. Tina, could you perhaps also share how your view on this is? How is your expectation? How was your experience? What would you think was the most interesting part of your experience in Santa Clara?
So I had a great experience at the Santa Clara Law School. People really were really welcoming us really warmly, and teachers. The interesting thing for me was that the classes were pretty small. I was not used to small classes with a few students. And what I really appreciated was that during classes, we had the opportunity to communicate and interact with the students as well as the professors, before class, during the class, after the class. And when it comes like content-wise, the biggest difference was for me that cases decided by the court were really, really important in the United States. So the first thing, or my first lesson or lecture I had, was on how to write a legal analysis of a court decision, which I hadn't done it before at all.
Mm. Yeah, that's probably also because of the differences in the legal system as a whole, right? So, exactly. Yeah, and Jess, you met Tina in class, or did you teach her, or were you a fellow colleague of her? So what exactly was the status?
Yeah,
or was it both?
Well, we sat in the same row as in internet law with Professor Goldman, so that's actually where I met her. I don't think I taught her, but we were definitely fellow colleagues. So it was super cool having the opportunity to meet you, Tina. Yeah.
So Eric, I think both of us share one part in our biography, which is that both of us started to teach internet law in the 90s. And when you compare students today to those that we had in the late 90s or in the beginning of the 21st century, what is the main difference of today's students compared to those 15 or 20 years ago in the field?
So this year I reached a milestone. This is the first year that I had students who were born after I had started teaching internet law in early 1996. And so we are truly dealing with a different generation of students who have grown up with a different slice of the internet than people of older generations had dealt with. So we talk about digital natives, but I really think that the better way to think about it are people who've never known anything other than the internet. The internet has always been infrastructure to them, like water or electricity or roads. It's just there, and it will always be there. And it's taken as background assumptions that the internet will give them the answers that they want, solve the problems that they expect to be solved, and always work. So it takes a lot of energy, I think, to help the students recognize that this is actually a pretty fortuitous circumstance that we have an internet that we currently have, and that it shouldn't be taken for granted. To think about that counterfactual. What would the internet look like if what would the world look like if we didn't have the internet today? The students that I'm teaching nowadays really can't even imagine that. And so it's a fun thought exercise, but really a challenging one, given how deeply ingrained the internet is in their experience.
Yeah, and I think Corona, at least here in Europe, I think Corona brought a new quality into this again, because now, again, everything is even more connected than it was before. And in particular, when it comes to teaching and learning, I think at least here in Europe, we see a next stage of the development, however. So students are, at least, I don't know, Tina, whether you share that impression, but my impression as a teacher is that teaching has significantly changed here in Europe in the last weeks because of Corona and because of the shutdown of the universities. So I think this is something which is rather new to the younger generation of students, but for people in our generation, it would have been completely unthinkable 20 years ago what's going on at the moment. So I don't know whether Tina, you share my view that things have changed in Europe here.
Yes, definitely. So also for myself, the first online class I ever had was legal research, the class that we are teaching at the department. And now all the professors are switching to online platforms and trying to teach online. And it's a new experience for students as well as teachers. And I think, well, one of the advantages of Corona is that more teachers get to know what kind of tools they are to use to do online teaching. Can be quite beneficial.
Yeah. And Jess, is it the same for you? I mean, is your learning experience significantly different now because of COVID-19, or is it quite just the same like before?
I would say it is significantly different. There's a lot of different factors at play. So for starters, it's just kind of difficult for students to be able to get out of this mindset of, okay, well, you know, home is home and school is school. And the nice thing about having school is that, you know, you would go to this building that was dedicated for learning, but when you're at home, you're now mixing your work-life balance a little bit. You're mixing work and life. So I think students are definitely struggling in that regard. And then on another note, there's a lot less motivation, I think, from what I've seen. With everything going on in the world right now, students are kind of just trying to get through it. So again, the focus has changed. You don't have as much concentration on your studies. And so that's from like the student's perspective. And then on the other side of it, it's a very different experience for professors as well. I don't think a lot of these professors that we have really were prepared to have to drastically change their teaching as well. I've kind of sat on both sides of it. So I've had an opportunity to help kind of teach a class, and it's super disconcerting when you have, you know, if everyone's got their mics off, everyone's got their videos off, it's super challenging because you don't get that kind of feedback that you're expecting to get from students that tells you whether they're understanding it or whether you need to kind of focus on a topic or not. So it's a really different dynamic now being online than it is in the classroom.
Yeah. Absolutely. And still, I mean, one of the funny things that I see as one of the dinosaurs of this field is that many of the legal sources we are dealing with still come from this time. So the e-commerce directive, for example, is from 2000. Quite some of the thinking when it comes to intellectual property comes from the early 21st century. When it comes to electronic signatures, identification, authentication, e-commerce, everything, a lot of this is still based on legal sources coming from this very, very early phase of the internet when Eric and myself started to teach this. And since then, the whole world has gone through more than just one very substantial changes. And we are quite in the middle of another one that you are quite clearly reporting, and that I completely agree with, because as my day-to-day experiences in teaching and in day-to-day life is very different from what it was 2 months ago. So my question then to all of you, and possibly to Eric first, would be, do you think that per se, because of Corona, we need to rethink about the regulatory environment of the internet as a whole, or do you think that the rules will survive after this crisis?
Well, I'll take a first crack at that, but I'll be interested to see what my colleagues think about that as well. From my perspective, I think the virus has proven the centrality of the internet to our lives. That there are a lot of economic and social functions that are now taking place only over the internet, and that we can't imagine doing them any other way. So it's a binary thing. Either we do them over the internet or we simply forego them altogether. And so that's to me, that's really good news, because it actually helps with that counterfactual. What would life be like without the internet? We can say, well, we literally can imagine how we couldn't do the things that we want to do in our lives without the tools. The question is, what happens when the other options come back? When we're able to go back to interacting with each other in physical space, does the internet remain the preferred mechanism to engage in those activities, or does it become just one of the options? Or will we go back and say, you know what, actually the internet was the best option at the time, but it's now inferior to the physical space options? And I think that's going to come up with things like education. I think it's going to come up with things like government, going to come up with things like working in service jobs. I think there's a lot of questions about what the internet's role will be when we have a choice. What did we learn from this experience that shows us that the internet actually is the best options that we have available to us?
Yeah, that will be very interesting to see, because when I see the debate in with my fellow colleagues now when it comes to teaching, and also when I hear what Jess told us before about her experience in learning, I think the average perspective is very different from mine, because mine would be, of course, the internet is the preferred option, and I very much prefer teaching and learning from the internet. But there are quite many people who don't share that opinion, right? And it will be interesting to see how universities will look like in 2 or 3 years when this crisis is over, how much of this internet wave that all of us see at the moment will then still be there. I don't know, Jess, what would you expect? So do you think that next year's classes will be very similar to those that you had a year ago, or will there be any difference?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot, actually, like what the new normal is supposed to look like. I think for starters, just because things are difficult right now, having moved to technology, doesn't mean that we can't adapt and make things better. I think this was in a really, as horrible as this experience has been, I think it's also been a really important one to kind of show that we are capable of using the internet to kind of get through maybe mundane tasks, like, for example, the work from home. If work from home is more successful, I know that that's a lot easier on people. And so it kind of showed like we can move our meetings online, we can successfully and productively be online. And then when it comes to school, again, it's a challenge right now, but I think over time, it's something that we'll be able to adapt to, and that professors, they'll have to change the way that they structure their classroom. But I think that that's a very doable change, just as the years kind of go by. And so again, I think that's going to show that this is something that can be done, and it might open up more doors and more educational opportunities for people that may not have the ability to travel to a campus, or, for example, like Tina, you could take more Santa Clara law classes, but if you enjoyed it, but now you're taking them online because we have that ability to do that. So I think it'll be different, but I think it might be a good kind of different.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also agree. I expect that after the crisis, it will be more of a mix. So most teachers probably will still want to teach in classrooms, but at least they could live stream them or record them, and so that students that cannot attend can just follow up with, like, from home or from wherever they are.
Yeah, but one of the outcomes I would see, at least at the moment, would be that the big platforms or intermediaries like Google, Facebook, YouTube, etc., are again winners of the development that we see at the moment. So, I mean, they are, in my perception, even more dominant than they were before. So that might trigger the question in how far the regulatory framework for those intermediaries needs to be changed again. And that's a debate that is quite intensely to be seen here in Europe, and I assume also in the US, in particular when it comes to liability exemptions for intermediaries, which brings us quite into the heart of your special field, Eric, and also Jess, which is Section 230, which is about liability and possible exemptions to liability for intermediaries. So could you kindly, perhaps for the European audience here, explain the core concept behind Section 230, and then explain to us in how far you think that this is under pressure now because of the corona-related developments that we have been talking about?
Let's just start by establishing its legal framework. Section 230 was enacted, as you mentioned, in the mid-90s. It was enacted in 1996. And it was really the first US law to expressly embrace and understand the internet. It was compounded with other laws that were also targeting the internet, but in a much harsher and more punitive way. Those laws got stripped out. What we got left with was a law that says that websites aren't liable for third-party content. It's a really basic principle, and it's easily summarized, but it gets everyone thinking, well, surely that can't be the rule. Let's talk about all the exceptions. Let's look for all the stress points with that. Let's try and change that basic principle that websites aren't liable for third-party content. Now, there are some statutory exceptions, intellectual property being one of them, but the basic principle has remained true for the last 25 years. And it differs from the e-commerce directive in a couple of pretty fundamental ways. The most important is that Section 230 applies even in the face of some kind of demand or takedown notice. So if a service has gotten notice that there's a potentially illegal or a tortious item on its service, Section 230 says if they ignore it, they're okay. The e-commerce directive says that's a guaranteed route to liability. Remember, intellectual property is accepted, so the e-commerce directive applies to intellectual property as well as other types of liability. Section 230 doesn't apply to intellectual property, but it picks up all those other types of cases that might apply. And so one of the other differences then with Section 230 is that because it doesn't cover intellectual property, we have separate rules for those. but it covers so many different use cases that you just assume are going to have different legal treatment. But Section 230 says they're all the same. Doesn't matter how you plead the case. Doesn't matter how the complaint is structured. The website's not liable for third-party content. So that principle has been, I think, an essential part of why the US internet has thrived over the last quarter century. But it has created or contributed to the development of some internet incumbents, like you mentioned, Google and Facebook. And there's a lot of stress about the power that they have, the amount of money that they're making, and possibly the kinds of consequences they're having on their society, which has led to the evolution of a set of groups of critics of those enterprises that are determined to find a way to take them down. And Section 230 is one of the vectors of attack. Antitrust law is another vector. Privacy law is another vector. But the goal is actually Google and Facebook. Section 230 is just the prop or the set piece that can be used to try to attack them. It's actually misguided. I'm happy to talk about why that change in Section 230 won't matter to Google or Facebook. But the battles over Section 230 are often a proxy for these broader stresses about the internet incumbents. And everyone else who relies on Section 230 is kind of along for the ride.
Yeah. Yeah, I can confirm that the debate is very similar in Europe. So the debate on the reform of the e-commerce directive is just one attack vector, and the targets are always Facebook, Google, in particular Facebook and Google. But it's not the only one. Antitrust and data protection, both of them being equally prominent here in Europe, and also intellectual property legislation, where we have a significant change to see at the moment, which is that the e-commerce directive is no longer, and the privileges coming out of the e-commerce directive are no longer the leading principles when it comes to intellectual property. So quite a similar development than the one that you had already in 1996 in the US, that intellectual property now comes to under a different regime. But perhaps, Jess, may I ask you, I mean, from a US perspective, would you think that this keeping intellectual property out of the scope of Section 230, is that evident? So is this something that is clearly understandable from a US background, or is this something which can only be understood if you put it into a historical perspective, going back to 1996?
So I'm not sure if I understand your question.
So let me rephrase. As Eric rightly put it, the e-commerce directive doesn't exclude per se intellectual property from the liability exemptions of intermediaries. So in principle, liability exemptions in Europe apply also when it comes to intellectual property, which is a long story because, of course, intellectual property has been in the center of quite some cases and discussions and reports. And the US, differently from Europe, has excluded intellectual property from the beginning from the applicability of Section 230, if I understand it correctly. And the question to you now would be in how far this looks evident to you that intellectual property is such a different animal that it should not be put under a rule like Section 230, or whether this is something which would need to be rediscussed nowadays.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm probably going to actually throw it back to Professor Goldman, who is the intellectual property expert here. But I will throw out there, we do have a safe harbor for intellectual property infringement in the United States. It's under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and it's Section 512. And so that is a separate, what we call a notice and takedown statute, that basically a web service has to provide an opportunity for a copyright owner to be able to report intellectual property infringement, and then that service is kind of obliged to take it down. And this has been somewhat problematic, actually, because what we're seeing is because they are so reliant on this safe harbor, and the safe harbor kind of has this notice and takedown requirement that Section 230 doesn't have. These services are a lot quicker to remove content without, maybe verifying or, establishing that that's something that should be removed. So we're seeing this issue where a lot of people will abuse the 512 harbor to kind of report content that wouldn't likely be considered a traditional intellectual property infringement, just to have that content removed. And I know Professor Goldman has touched on this in kind of calling it like a copyright memory hole, where you can get around. You can do like other claims and violations that may not be related to IP, but that get your speech taken down. So I know that is particularly problematic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if I can add to that, and maybe we can include a link to the paper just mentioned. It's called Copyright's Memory Hole, and it in the show notes. And it's designed to show how if we have these two different levels of treatment for different types of claims, how people who want to scrub the internet will go to the most restrictive type of option and then weaponize it. So we've seen the weaponization of copyright takedown notices for purposes that have nothing to do with copyright. It's just they can't get around Section 230, so Section 512 provides a better mechanism for them to try and advance their censorial goals. So I think that's really the question I would ask this group, or rhetorically, is can we look at this differential treatment between copyright on the one hand and Section 230 preempted claims on the other hand, and decide, is there something we can learn between the two? Which one is the better model? The notice and takedown scheme, the more close to absolute immunity? What have we learned in the last 25 years that tells us which one works better? Or in fact, maybe we've learned in the last 25 years there really is a reason to treat them differently.
I mean, the average answer that you would receive in Europe on this question would be none of the two worked, right? So, I think the mainstream doctrine here in Europe at the moment is very skeptical, and in particular also in Brussels. So when the reform of the e-commerce directive is debated within the European Commission, I think the mainstream perception at the moment would be that not even the notice and take down approach really helped a lot, because it did in particular not hinder major players like Facebook and Google and others to further increase their rhetorical power. And it did not hinder intermediaries not to chase infringements of all kinds of laws on the internet. So I think the average answer in Europe would be, we need something new, which looks very different and which gets rid of these exemptions in the regulatory framework.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing that kind of trend here in the US as well, that in general, everyone's looking to dismantle the existing legal system and make it more, to increase the scope of legal liability. The one thing I'll note is that there is a floor about how far that can go that's set by the First Amendment. We're not exactly sure where that First Amendment floor is set, but there is a minimum floor, and my guess is it is higher than any of the protections for free expression that you have in Europe. So, so we're more likely to run into that First Amendment floor as those regulators keep deconstructing the legal scheme.
Yes. And I think probably in the US, at least I would expect this to be, I think the people are more aware that any change in Section 230 and similar norms will again lead to a situation where players like Facebook and Google will profit from, and it will not hit them. But on the contrary, it will make it more difficult for new market entries to appear. Which is not really fully understood here in Europe, I think. I think the European legislation is more optimistic that changes in the regulatory framework might change might change or might increase the possibility for new players to enter the market, which is in my view wrong. But I think, Eric, we share our view that this is not really what's going to be, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, here in the US even, a lot of regulators either don't care or are okay with the idea that any regulatory change is going to further instantiate the incumbencies. I think it's obvious. I don't know how anyone can think otherwise. And yet there are a lot of people who are choosing to live in a fantasy land and thinking that that won't be the case, that they'll be able to stick it to Google or Facebook. And we haven't discussed, but let me just acknowledge, you were talking about different regulatory systems. I've been keeping a close eye on the UK online harms proposal, which strikes me as one of the next wave of regulatory innovations we're going to see across the world, including attempts here in the US to do something similar. And it's clear that these are going to completely favor Google and Facebook by basically putting them into a regulatory dance with the regulators and keeping it so that anyone else can't get into that dance.
Strange, yeah, really strange. However, I mean, one of the Corona-related problems within this problem is now that again these major players are in Europe quite intensely under debate because of this, the fact that they might not be very successful in eliminating misleading content, and as they are so important to the day-to-day experience and media consumption of so many Europeans, there is again an additional pressure on them to more actively censor, I would call it, so forgive me for that word, censor content on the internet. And I would assume that this debate is also quite important at the moment in the US, isn't it?
You know, we don't know how to have that discussion because we don't really have a clear understanding of what constitutes misinformation, especially in a situation like this, where it's really a health or science discussion that's being played out by lay non-experts. And so pretty much everything we're hearing is some form of misinformation or subject to scientific or factual debate. But the real struggle that I think we're having here in the US is that the government has become one of the biggest sources of misinformation. And, you know, I mean, as you know, and I'm sure the Europeans are watching closely, our president is saying some really horrendous things that qualify as misinformation under any legitimate definition of that term. And so what do we really want the internet companies to do in that circumstance? Do we want them to shut off government announcements because they're clearly lying to us? Do we want them to try to rebut them somehow and take the role of being the fourth estate or some kind of quasi-government adjudicator of truth? Do we want to let the government have its say and then hope that the marketplace of ideas will correct that misimpression? And the problem that we have here in the US, and I'm pretty sure you have it in Europe as well, is that the regulators want all of the above. They want it to, like, you know, they want the government to have its say, but they want the misinformation to be eliminated. It's like, pick one. And I don't think we can pick one.
And what would you recommend to do then? Keep everything as it is, or?
So that's a pretty complicated question. So on this particular topic, it's been my personal view that we should turn off the government's ability to talk via social media directly to its constituents. That the social media companies cannot police what the government's saying. They can't arbitrate its truth. And therefore, allowing the government to have direct, unfiltered communications with their constituents creates the opportunity for the government to perniciously lie to its constituents. So I think the better solution is when there's actually a media filter, some kind of intermediary who is fact-checking the government statements as they come out, and saying, okay, President Trump said that you can go and digest this fish tank cleaner and this will fix your innards. And say, actually, here's the following health experts to tell you that this will cause you to die. Without that kind of checking in real time by experts who are organized through the media, I don't know that the marketplace of information of ideas can fully fix it, which is why we can't let that kind of unfiltered communication take place. So that's actually probably not what you would expect, I'd say, because normally I'd like everyone to have their say. But it turns out that because the government is such a key source of misinformation in the current environment, we had to find a way to fix that. And I don't know how the internet companies can do that unilaterally.
But I think one of the problems, at least that we in Europe we have on this, it's not only the government giving all kinds of misleading information, But as you rightly mentioned, everyone is a source of misleading information. And some do this on purpose and some do it because they can't avoid it. And that makes it completely random, I would say, how each and everyone's filter bubble looks like and what each of us therefore believes as some kind of truth at the moment. And it's very, very difficult then to put some kind of regulatory role on those intermediaries. And actually, this is something which was already seen as a problem in the 90s. So I think, Eric, to come back to this again, I think the basic idea of all these rules that came up in the 90s is still very true and still very clear, which is there is a difference between a traditional media channel and a social network or a website or an internet service, and we need to keep these differences. I don't know, Jess, would you agree on this, or is it very different from what you would say?
Yeah, I think the internet is, special, unique, different. It gives us all of these kind of nuances compared to traditional media. And so the one thing I've been kind of thinking about is we're talking about should intermediaries be liable, or should regulators step in regarding, COVID-19 content? But we were having these same discussions regarding political advertising just months ago. Yes. And I think, the next topic, whatever that's going to be, it's going to be something different from COVID, but we're going to be coming back to these same conversations, I think, as long as the internet is still around. And so I'm pressed to figure out how we can draw regulatory lines every single time something new like that kind of comes up. I think it's super important too that we're very specific about the problem that we're trying to solve. So, if it's misinformation or disinformation, I think Professor Goldman got at it, exactly. We need to be able to first define what misinformation is, and that definition is so different depending on the concept that the topic that you're discussing. So. I know this is also a challenge for, some of the bigger players right now. I've had discussions with them. A lot of folks think that these services should just remove anything related to COVID-19, whether it's misinformation, disinformation, or fact. It shouldn't be on the internet. And the problem with that is that we're also living in a time where people are relying on the internet to now make money, or to, even for mental health reasons or whatnot. But user-generated content is kind of taking the forefront in people's lives. And so is it smart to, or is it right to say, okay, well, no one can create content about COVID-19 when COVID-19 content is literally everyone is reading about and tweeting about and talking about? Is that something that we want to restrict? So, but then again, how do you draw that line on, okay, this person can talk about COVID-19, this quote unquote trusted news source can talk about it, but this person can't? Or, this person can do a parody on this information, but because, if it's not obviously a parody, then someone might misinterpret. There's so many different questions here that it's almost impossible to be able to draw a regulatory line for these services to hold them accountable. And then once you draw those lines, that's the part of the internet that just says, okay, well, users will then push the envelope and you'll have to continuously redraw the lines.
Yes. Tina, I mean, you saw both debates in the US and in Europe. So what would your answer be on this? Do you see any differences in how Europeans deal with this and the US political debate is taking the issue?
I think it's pretty similar when it comes to fake news. I mean, fake news is a bigger topic, I think, right now in the United States because it was connected to the elections, which wasn't really a case here in Europe, as far as I know. But I agree with Jess, it's really difficult to decide on what is right, what is misinformation, what is a fact, what is just an opinion, how far can we go? Do we restrict the freedom of speech then by deciding on what fake news is or not? It's a really complicated and difficult topic, and you would also have to spend a lot of money for the staff to look through all of that. Or are you using artificial intelligence, or what kind of tools or means would you have to even decide on what is fake news and what is not?
Yeah, and does any of you have any opinion on approaches, for example, chosen by Facebook to make up their own regulatory framework so that advisory boards or external people, ethical clearance boards, etc., should help them in assessing what is legitimate content and what needs to be deleted? Would that be an approach that you would support? So some kind of non-state and non-legal approach to regulate things?
Jess, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to see how the Facebook oversight board ends up playing out. I think it's an interesting concept. I still think the same content moderation challenges are still going to exist, though, whether you have an independent board or not. I thought that was a great, I guess, approach from Facebook to kind of ensure diverse content decision making. But you know, at the same time, time will tell. We'll have to see if it really changes anything, if it's really any different than you know how Facebook handles content now. And again, content policy has to be changed as well from the head. So Facebook will have to make their own internal decisions along with the board if we are going to see any real change.
Yeah, I think the thing I find most interesting about the board is it's trying to prop up the overall artifice that Facebook's adopted, that it can have a single set of Facebook law that applies universally across its entire population. And so if the board pronounces this is the new state of Facebook law, and it conflicts with the law of one or more jurisdictions, I don't really see how Facebook has solved its problem. It can blame the board to say, well, this is why we're now digressing from local law because this board told us we could. But I don't think it's going to change how the regulators are going to respond. So to me, I think the biggest challenge isn't the board per se. I actually think that there's some merit to the idea that Facebook's pursuing, but it's all in support of a proposition I don't think it can win in the end, which is that it can have a single law across its entire 3 billion user base.
Yeah. Do you see any significant differences in how the different major companies approach the problem? So would you want to say that, I don't know, Facebook is doing better than Twitter, or Google is doing worse than Yahoo or whatever? I mean, Yahoo is no longer on the market, I know, but any other. So whatever you would, I mean, Yahoo would have been one of those that we would have debated in the 90s, right? So is there any clear difference that you would like to make here, or are they very similar?
No, I really think Facebook stands alone in that Facebook has adopted a single uniform set of Facebook policies, or what I called Facebook law, that it tries to apply across all jurisdictions. The more traditional approach for internet companies is to set up a local subsidiary and then modify its service offerings and policies to reflect the rules of that local country. And that has some downsides, but it solves the friction that Facebook has created by trying to tell the countries, I don't like your law. I'm not planning to comply with it. I'm going to comply with this thing that I call Facebook law, and you're just going to have to deal with it. And I think one of the reasons why regulators across the globe are gunning for Facebook is because of the fact that Facebook has broken the ranks from the industry standard approaches for localizing their services.
Jess, would you agree? I think you agree, right?
I think I cautiously agree. I think it's really hard to compare internet services and the way that they approach content moderation because, again, you have so many differences. What works for Facebook may not work for Twitter's users or for Google or for YouTube. So I think the better question really we'll get at, and again, that's why I said time will tell, is the oversight board are they productive in getting us to a more, I guess, socially productive conversation or a socially healthy conversation? And so that's where I would like to see what ends up happening. Are they improving social discourse? Is it staying the same? Because I mean, there's a lot of different policies you can compare it to, like with Twitter and YouTube, for example, where what they're doing, if you want to use COVID or you want to do political advertising, it's actually greatly helped the misinformation, disinformation issue, or it's helped bolster communities and their conversations. So I think it's hard to make that comparison because it really does depend on the content, it depends on the issue, and it depends on the users.
Yeah. Okay, let me perhaps finish with a very general and very difficult question to all of you, and I will start with Tina, if I may. Tina, if I ask you, would you expect the e-commerce directive to still be in force in 2 years, so after this crisis, or would you expect that the European legislator will have come up with something completely new now, trying to regulate fake news and similar phenomena on the internet more aggressively than it is at the moment? And I will then ask the two US guests of this whether this is the same, what you would expect with Section 230 to happen. But Tina, perhaps you start with the e-commerce directive.
I assume that in 2 years, probably Europe will try to more aggressively try to regulate this, but honestly, I wouldn't know how Europe would be able to do that. I wouldn't know what kind of tools they would use. I wouldn't know how they can decide whether something is fake or not. And I think a lot of people would always bring the argument of the freedom of speech. So I think it will be difficult in Europe to have something like content moderation, someone looking through all the content and see whether something is misleading or not. Like technically it will be difficult, and legally I think there are a lot of reasons why it might be a problem, especially the freedom of speech.
Jess, would you continue?
Yeah, so from the US side, I have my concerns about Section 230. I think anyone in this field does, just seeing how things have played out recently in Congress. But I also think that we're going to be having this conversation probably forever. Again, like I said, whether it's political advertising, whether it's COVID-19, the drug opioid crisis, or children and, sexual abuse materials. I think we're going to continuously come back to this topic of, is the internet harming people, and how can we regulate the internet? So the concern part of me about Section 230's fate comes from the fact that there's a lot of bipartisan dislike for Section 230. And there's also this, general, feeling of, falling out of love with the internet, with just society. So I'll be interested to see what actually comes of that. On the other side, though, I think the current generation we're seeing a lot of tech positivity. I think the current situation that we're in with the health crisis is showing how much we're really relying on the internet. So to me, it could really go either way. But I think the more important point is that I don't think these conversations are going away, and we need to be thinking critically what we're going to do from there.
Yeah. True. Eric?
So from my perspective, COVID-19 has shown us just how important the internet is to our society. And what really stood out to me is how quickly we were able to transition from offline institutions into replicating their functions online, using services that are actually in existence and able to do what they do because of Section 230. So whether that's transitioning over to Zoom or transitioning over to an ed tech platform, or moving conversations over to social media services, whether that's Facebook or Slack or wherever it is, all of these services are around and able to do what they do because of Section 230. And we just take that for granted. We just assume that we can flip that switch, and all of a sudden we no longer have face-to-face meetings, but we can have these online meetings like the one we're currently having, the one that will be hosted on YouTube. And all of that's taking place because of the backdrop of Section 230. So in a logical world, we would draw from that insight, wow, Section 230 has helped us operate our society in the face of a pandemic, and it allowed us to curb the pandemic by giving us adequate substitutes for the face-to-face interactions. What can we do to advance that cause? How can we help technologists continue to build the kind of tools and infrastructure we need in order to be able to combat the next pandemic or whatever the next crisis will be that keeps us from being able to interact face-to-face? Unfortunately, and Jess was getting at this, there's a wide list of people who have been activated as viewing Section 230 as their problem. Some of them are victims groups, in many cases, who have legitimate concerns. Others are just purely rent-seeking. So, for example, the media industry keeps bashing Google and Facebook, not really because Google and Facebook are threats to them per se, but just because they want the money. And so there's a lot of competitive gaming going on. And so when we get out of the crisis, when we're back to having, quote, rational discussions about internet policy, we're going to have all the same dynamics about the tension between free speech and harmful speech. And then we're going to have this continued overlay of competitive gaming that is going to really distort the conversation. So my hope is we take away the lesson that Section 230 is what allowed us to fight the pandemic using technology tools. What we're going to take away is there's new incumbents that we want their money. And that puts Section 230 in substantial jeopardy.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That was a very, very strong and in some parts pessimistic, in other parts very optimistic final statement. I appreciated that you took your time. Very, very grateful we are here in Vienna for this. Thank you. I'm very much looking forward to hopefully seeing you somewhere, sometime in reality and not just on the internet. Thank you to all three of you. Have a wonderful day, afternoon or morning, and stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.